In 1926, there was nothing here, just empty grassland in the Texas Panhandle. Flat, dry, wind-blown prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. A few cattle, a few ranches, almost no people. And then, in the space of 90 days, 45,000 people showed up. Not over 10 years, not over 5, in 90 days. A city the size of a major town appeared almost overnight on empty grass, built out of tents and packing crates and raw lumber, thrown up in the mud as fast as men could hammer. There was oil under that ground. And when the word got out, the desperate and the dangerous and the greedy came pouring in from all over the country, until this patch of nothing became one of the wildest, most lawless places in the entire United States. They called it Boomtown. For 3 years, it was a town with almost no law at all, run not by a mayor or a sheriff, but by a criminal syndicate. A town with 2,000 prostitutes and a 3-mile main street and gambling dens and bootleg whiskey and killing so common that nobody bothered to count. A town so out of control that the governor of Texas finally sent in the Rangers, and when that wasn't enough, sent in the National Guard and put the entire county under martial law. This is the story of Borger, Texas. How it exploded out of empty prairie into a city of 45,000 in a single season. How it became so violent and so corrupt that the state of America had to send in soldiers to take it back. And how it cost the man who built it his own life. Because the founder of Borger, the man whose name is still on the town today, was murdered in his own city, shot to death getting his mail. Let's go back to the beginning, to the oil, and the man who saw his chance. The story starts under the ground, with one of the great oil discoveries of the American West. To understand Borger, you have to understand what oil did to Texas in the early 20th century. In 1901, a gusher called Spindletop had come roaring out of the earth in East Texas, and it changed everything. It announced to the world that Texas was sitting on an ocean of oil, and it set off a frenzy that would last for decades. Wherever a new field was struck, the same thing happened. A wild stampede of drillers, speculators, roughnecks, and fortune hunters racing to the spot, throwing up an instant town and chasing the black gold before someone else got it first. The Texas oil boom created a whole culture of these overnight cities. Most of them were rough, but none of them, not one, would ever get as rough as Borger. For decades, the Texas Panhandle had been cattle country. Enormous ranches, endless grass, a hard and empty land where the wind never stopped blowing. But beneath that grass lay one of the largest oil and gas fields ever found in North America. Through the early 1920s, drillers had been hitting oil and gas across the Panhandle, and the strikes kept getting bigger. Then, in 1926, a series of huge gushers came in along the Canadian River in Hutchinson County, and the news went out across the oil world. There was a fortune in the ground up here, and it was wide open. Now, when oil is discovered, the men who get rich are not only the ones who own the wells. There is another kind of fortune to be made, by the man who builds the town. Because 45,000 oil workers need somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat, somewhere to drink, and somewhere to spend their wages. Whoever owns the land they do all that on can get richer than almost any driller. And there was a man who understood that better than just about anyone alive. His name was Arthur Philip Borger. Everyone called him Ace. Ace Borger was a townsite promoter. That was his actual profession, building boomtowns. He had done it before in Oklahoma and elsewhere. Rush in when a boom started, buy up the land, lay out a town, sell the lots at enormous markups, and move on with the profits. He had a reputation across Oklahoma and Texas as a sharp, shrewd operator who knew exactly how to turn a discovery into a city, and a city into cash. This was a particular kind of American character, the boom promoter, half visionary and half huckster. Men like Ace Borger were salesmen of the highest order. They sold not just land, but a dream, the promise that if you came and bought in, you could get rich too, that you could get in on the ground floor of the next great thing. They understood crowds and greed and hope, and they knew how to turn all three into money. Ace Borger was one of the best who ever worked the trade. But there was a flaw built into the whole business, and Borger embodied it perfectly. A promoter's job is to start the stampede. It is not, and it cannot be to control where the stampede goes once it begins. Ace Borger was about to light a fire he had no way of putting out. In March of 1926, Ace Borger and his business partner, an attorney named John R. Miller, bought a 240-acre stretch of land near the Canadian River, right in the middle of the new oil strike. They laid out a town site. They named it Borger, after Ace himself. And then Ace Borger did the thing he was truly a genius at. He advertised. He flooded the region with promotion. Handbills, newspaper ads, word of mouth, promising opportunity, riches, work, a fresh start in the great Panhandle oil boom. And it worked beyond anyone's wildest expectation. The response was not a trickle. It was a flood. Within 90 days of the town being founded, more than 45,000 people had arrived. Think about what that actually means on the ground. There was no city waiting for them. There was a plan on paper and a patch of prairie. So the people built as they came, and they came faster than anyone could build. Main Street stretched out 3 miles long, a chaotic ribbon of hastily thrown together businesses. Tents, shacks made of packing crates and tar paper, wooden buildings going up overnight, hotels with men sleeping in shifts in the same beds. One crew renting a bed for 8 hours, then handing it to the next. Cafes, supply stores, drilling outfits and saloons, all crammed together in a sea of mud. And it was mud, constantly. There was no real sanitation, no sewer system, no paved streets. When it rained, the whole town turned into a swamp of black, oily muck that swallowed boots and bogged down cars. Water itself was scarce and had to be hauled in and sold by the barrel. Disease followed fast. Typhoid and other sicknesses spread through the filthy, overcrowded camp. People lived rough, and many of them lived dangerous. Just how primitive were the conditions? Consider this. In a town that swelled to 45,000 people, there was reportedly not a single flush toilet anywhere. Not one. Before water wells could be drilled, all the drinking water was carried in on tank wagons and sold to the thirsty crowds. Most of the new arrivals were transient, drifters and oil chasers with no roots, living in canvas tents and shacks slapped together from whatever scrap lumber and tar paper they could find. And Borger grew so fast and so chaotically that rival promoters tried to cash in right beside it. Neighboring ranchers laid out their own competing town sites next door, with names like Isom and Dixon Creek, hoping to grab a piece of the flood. It was a sprawling, lawless, improvised mess of humanity dropped onto the open plains. And almost from the start, people gave it the name that stuck. Boomtown, a place that drew the toughest hoodlums and the most wanted fugitives in the entire Southwest. And the pace of it broke the mind. Every train that pulled into the new spur line disgorged another crowd of hopefuls with their bags and their tools. The roads into town were choked with cars and wagons and trucks, bumper to bumper, all crawling through the mud toward the promise of work and money. Lumber couldn't arrive fast enough to build with. Goods sold out as fast as they could be stocked. Men paid outrageous prices for a cot, a meal, a drink, a place out of the wind. In the span of a single season, an empty pasture had become one of the larger settlements in the Texas Panhandle. And it had happened so fast that nothing about it was planned, or safe, or stable. It was a city built at a dead run, and it showed. By October of 1926, just months after it was founded, Borger was officially incorporated as a city, and John Miller, Ace's partner, was elected mayor. The railroad pushed a spur line into town. A post office opened, a school district was formed, telephone service and electricity arrived before the year was out. On paper, Borger was becoming a real city at astonishing speed. And we should be clear about who most of these people were, because it's easy to lose them in the story of the vice. The great majority of the men who came to Borger came to work. They were oilfield hands, roughnecks and roustabouts and drillers. And the work they did was brutal and dangerous. They worked the rigs in the wind and the cold and the heat, hauling pipe, wrestling machinery, standing over wells that could blow out without warning. When a gusher came in, it could throw a column of oil and gas hundreds of feet into the air, and a single spark could turn it into an inferno. Men were crushed, burned, and killed in the fields with grim regularity. These were tough, hard-working people chasing a paycheck and a future, and they earned every dollar in sweat and risk. The tragedy of Borger is partly that all those honest, hard-working people found themselves trapped in a town run by the very worst elements of American society, because underneath that paper city, something darker was taking shape. The same things that made Borger explode. The easy money, the flood of strangers, the total absence of established law also made it a magnet for the worst people in America. And they were about to take the whole town over. When you build a city of 45,000 people in 90 days, in the middle of nowhere, with no established police force and rivers of cash flowing through it, you create something irresistible to a certain kind of person, not the oil worker. The predator Borger filled up not just with drillers and laborers and merchants, but with gamblers, bootleggers, con men, prostitutes, thieves and killers. Fugitives on the run from the law in other states discovered that Borger was the perfect place to disappear. Nobody asked questions. Nobody knew who you were. And the money was everywhere, in cash, in the pockets of thousands of young men with nothing to spend it on but vice. And vice was the town's biggest business. The center of it was a stretch known as Dixon Street. Dixon Street was the beating heart of sin in Borger, and by the standards of 1920s America, it was almost unbelievable. Brothels operating wide open, dance halls, gambling houses running games around the clock, slot machines, and speakeasies pouring illegal liquor on every block. Because remember, this was the height of prohibition. Alcohol was illegal everywhere in the United States. In Borger, it flowed like water. At its peak, the town was home to an estimated 2,000 prostitutes. 2,000, in a town that had not existed 2 years earlier. Whole operations were run by figures who became local legends. Madams and vice bosses who managed the trade openly, paying off whoever needed to be paid off to keep the doors open. Names like Ma and Pa Murphy, who ran prostitution operations across the district, became notorious throughout the region. Picture a night on Dixon Street at the height of it. The street is a roar of noise and light spilling out of 100 doorways, player pianos and jazz bands hammering away in the dance halls, the clatter of roulette wheels and the shouts from the craps tables. Oil workers fresh off a shift, their pockets full of cash, pouring into the saloons to drink bootleg whiskey that might blind them as easily as get them drunk. Gunshots somewhere down the block and nobody turning ahead. Card shops and pickpockets and con men working the crowd. Women in the doorways and windows. And money. Money everywhere, changing hands all night long, flowing from the calloused hands of the workers into the soft hands of the syndicate. It was said you could get anything you wanted in Borger at any hour for the right price. And what you most often got in the end was robbed or beaten or killed. Violence was simply part of daily life. Men were murdered over card games, over women, over insults, over nothing at all. Bodies turned up in the mud and in the brush along the creeks. With the law itself in on the racket, killers rarely faced any consequence. A man could disappear in Borger, and the only record of it might be an empty bed and an unpaid bill. And that is the key to understanding Borger. The vice wasn't hiding. It wasn't an underground operating in the shadows against the authorities. In Borger, the vice and the authorities were the same thing, because the town government had been captured, almost from the start, by an organized crime syndicate. At the center of it was a man named Richard Herwig, known to everyone as Two-Gun Dick. Two-Gun Dick Herwig was an associate of the mayor himself, and he was reportedly already under indictment for murder up in Oklahoma when he came to Borger. In Borger, he became something like the real boss of the town. His syndicate didn't fight the law. It was the law. They controlled the local government, the police, the officials who were supposed to keep order. And they ran the town like a business, a criminal business. One of Herwig's operations was a protection racket built on the prostitution trade. The roughly 2,000 women working in Borger were charged regular fines, which were really just shakedown payments, stay-in business fees collected by the syndicate. He dealt in stolen cars. The gambling, the liquor, the brothels, all of it paid tribute to the men who ran the town. Law enforcement officers were either on the payroll or looked the other way. If you were connected, you could do anything. If you crossed the syndicate, you could end up dead in the mud, and nobody would ever be charged. This was Borger at its wildest. A city of tens of thousands drowning in oil money, where crime wasn't breaking the rules, crime made the rules. People started calling it the wickedest town in America. And for a while, it earned the title. But a place like that cannot stay invisible forever. Word of what was happening in Borger spread across Texas. Honest citizens, and there were many, the workers and families and shopkeepers just trying to make a living, began to plead for help. Petitions went out. Investigators filed alarming reports, and eventually, those pleas reached the desk of the governor of Texas, and the governor decided to send in the most feared lawman in the American West. The Texas Rangers, in the spring of 1927, Governor Daniel Moody ordered a detachment of Texas Rangers into Borger to break the grip of the syndicate and bring some order to the town. And these were not ordinary lawmen. The detachment was led by two of the most legendary Rangers who ever lived. One was Captain Tom Hickman, a famous Ranger of the era. The other was a name that would echo through American history, Captain Frank Hamer. If that name sounds familiar, here's why. Frank Hamer was already a legend in Texas as a tough, fearless, almost unstoppable lawman. And a few years after Borger, Frank Hamer would be the man who tracked down and ended the careers of two of the most notorious outlaws in American history, Bonnie and Clyde. That was the caliber of lawman the state of Texas sent into Borger. They didn't send a sheriff. They sent the men who hunted the deadliest criminals in the country. When the Rangers came to a town like Borger, they had a method, and it was not gentle. The Texas Rangers operated on reputation as much as force. The idea that one ranger was worth a small army, and that when they came for you, your options were limited. They rounded up the undesirables, the gamblers, the pimps, the con men, the drifters with no honest business, and they made it very clear that these people had a choice. Leave town, or face the consequences. Because the jail could never hold the number of men they arrested, the Rangers improvised. They would run a long chain, a trace chain, and shackle their prisoners to it out in the open, a whole line of criminals chained together under guard for all the town to see. It was a deliberate humiliation and a deliberate message. The free ride was over. Frank Hamer in particular was not a man to be trifled with. He was enormous, fearless, and had survived being shot multiple times across his career. He had no patience for crooks and no fear of them. When a man like that walks into your town with a badge and a mandate from the governor, the smart criminals start packing. And many of them did. They cleaned house with a hard hand, and it worked at first. The Rangers were a stabilizing force. They drove a lot of the worst characters out of Borger. For a while, the town was calmer, more orderly, less openly criminal. But here is the problem with cleaning up a town like Borger. The rot wasn't just in the criminals passing through. The rot was in the government itself. The syndicate that ran the town was deeply entrenched, woven into the officials, the local law, the institutions. You could run the drifters out, but the corrupt power structure underneath stayed in place. And as soon as the Rangers' attention moved elsewhere, the crime and the vice came creeping back. So Borger's lawless era didn't end cleanly in 1927. It dragged on, flaring up again and again for the next 2 years. The syndicate held on, the vice districts reopened, the corruption continued, and the violence kept simmering, until it finally boiled over into the act that would bring the full weight of the state of Texas down on the town once and for all. The murder of a man who had dared to fight back. And it's worth understanding just how trapped the honest people of Borger were in those years. Because there were decent people here. Thousands of them. Families, merchants, churchgoers. Oil workers who wanted nothing more than a safe place to live and raise their children. They watched their town be stolen by criminals, and many of them tried to fight back. They organized. They petitioned. They demanded clean government and honest law. But fighting the syndicate in Borger was a terrifying proposition. The people you would report a crime to were often working for the criminals. The officials you would vote out controlled the count. And the men who ran the town had already shown they would kill anyone who became a real threat. To stand up in Borger was to paint a target on your own back. That is the climate in which one man decided to take on the syndicate directly, and paid for it with his life. His name was John Holmes, and he was the district attorney. John Holmes was one of the people in Borger who refused to play along. As district attorney, his job was to prosecute crime, and unlike so many of the officials around him, he actually tried to do it. He went after the syndicate, he pursued the corruption, he made himself a direct threat to the men who ran the town, and he would not be bought or scared off. In a town controlled by killers, that made him a marked man. On September 18th, 1929, John Holmes was assassinated. He was gunned down by an unknown attacker, shot dead, almost certainly on the orders of the criminal interests he had been fighting. The man whose entire purpose was to bring law to Borger was murdered by the lawlessness he was trying to destroy. And that murder was a step too far. Killing prostitutes and gamblers and drifters in the mud was one thing. Assassinating the district attorney, an official of the state of Texas, in cold blood, to protect a criminal empire, was a direct challenge to the authority of the government itself. The state could not let it stand. 10 days later, on September 28, 1929, Governor Dan Moody signed a proclamation that was almost unheard of in an American city. He declared martial law over the entire county. Martial law. This is the thing governments do in war zones and disasters: the suspension of normal civilian government, the imposition of military rule. Moody declared it over Hutchinson County, Texas, and he backed it with force. He sent in the Texas Rangers again, and this time he sent the Texas National Guard alongside them. Soldiers in the streets of an American oil town. And this time, they did not just trim the edges. The National Guard troops came under the command of a general named Jacob Walters, and they arrived in force. A whole cavalry unit rolling into Borger by train, soldiers pouring out alongside the Rangers already on the ground. And what followed was a total military takedown of the town. Under martial law, the troops and the Rangers went after the whole rotten structure. They conducted raids around the clock, 24 hours a day. They smashed and closed every illegal still and saloon they could find, confiscating whiskey and beer by the truckload. They searched the town for weapons. They rounded up criminals on a massive scale and held suspects in makeshift open-air pens because there was nowhere else to put them all. And then they did the most extraordinary thing of all. They went after the government itself. The commanding general demanded the resignation of practically the entire local power structure. The sheriff and all of his deputies, the constables and their deputies, the mayor, the city commission, and every member of the police department. The whole corrupt apparatus that had let the syndicate rule Borger was ordered to step down. The military didn't just arrest the criminals. It dismantled the rotten government that had protected them. By the time martial law was lifted in the middle of October 1929, the back of organized crime in Borger had been broken. It was a stunning thing. A city in the United States, in peacetime, placed under military rule because civilian law had completely failed. Its mayor, its police, its sheriff, all forced out by soldiers. That is how far gone Borger was. It took an army to take it back. When the soldiers finally left and normal government returned, the wildest chapter of Borger's history was over. The syndicate was broken. The worst of the vice was driven out. The town slowly began to settle into something more like an ordinary place. But the violence of Borger had one more terrible act to play. And this time, it would claim the most famous name in town, the founder himself. Through all of it, the boom, the vice, the rangers, the martial law. Ace Borger had remained one of the most powerful men in the town that bore his name. He had made his fortune. He held interests in banks and businesses. He was a major figure in local affairs, with deep ties to the politics and money of the region. But power in a place like Borger made enemies, and one enemy in particular would prove fatal. His name was Arthur Huey. Huey was a local official, a county treasurer, and he and Ace Borger had become locked in a bitter, personal feud. The details ran through money and politics and grudges, the kind of poisonous quarrel that festers in a small, violent town. At one point, Huey was jailed on an embezzlement charge, and he wanted Ace Borger's help to get out. And Borger refused to help him. For Huey, that refusal became the final insult. He began making threats against Ace Borger's life. On August 31st, 1934, Ace Borger walked into the post office in the town he had founded to get his mail. Arthur Huey was waiting for him. Huey confronted him, shouting, and then opened fire. He shot Ace Borger 5 times with a Colt .45 pistol, and then in an act of pure rage, Huey grabbed Borger's own gun, a .44 that the founder was carrying, and fired it into him 4 more times. 9 shots in total. Ace Borger died there, in the post office, in the middle of Borger, Texas, killed by a man he had quarreled with, using in part his own weapon. The man who had conjured a city out of empty prairie, who had pulled 45,000 people onto bare grass with the promise of riches, was murdered in that very city, gunned down on an ordinary day picking up his mail. And here is the final, bitter twist. Arthur Huey was put on trial for the killing, and he was acquitted. He walked free, claiming he had acted in self-defense. The founder of Borger was shot 9 times in a public building, and no one was ever punished for it. Even in death, Ace Borger could not escape the lawlessness of the town he had created. The violence he had helped unleash by building a city with no rules in the middle of nowhere finally circled back and took his own life, and then let his killer go. That is the tragedy at the heart of Borger. A man built a town to get rich. The town became a monster, and in the end the monster ate its maker, so you might expect that to be the end of the story. The founder dead, the boom over, the wild town fading away into the dust like so many other boomtowns of the American West. There are ghost towns all across Texas and Oklahoma that were born in an oil rush and died when the oil moved on. Places that blazed for a few years and then vanished back into the prairie. That was the normal fate of a boomtown. The pattern was almost a law of nature. Oil is discovered. The stampede arrives. A town explodes out of the ground, wild and rich, for a few short years, and then the wells run dry, or the price of oil collapses, or the drillers move on to the next big strike, and the town empties out as fast as it filled. The workers leave, the businesses close, the buildings are abandoned or hauled away. And within a decade, the place that had teemed with thousands is back to silence and grass, marked only by a few crumbling foundations and a name on an old map. America is littered with these corpses of the oil age. By every expectation, Borger should have been one of them. The vice was gone, the founder would soon be dead, the wild days were ending. The town had every reason to fade. But that is not what happened to Borger. And the reason it survived is the most important part of its later history. Borger did not die when the wild days ended, because the thing underneath it never left. The oil and the gas were still there. Not just a quick gusher to be drained and abandoned, but one of the great energy fields in North America, with decades of production still in the ground. And that meant Borger could become something a boomtown almost never becomes. Permanent. The key was that the oil business in Borger grew up. It went from wildcatters and chaos to the big established energy companies who came to build for the long term. Most importantly, Phillips Petroleum, one of the major American oil companies, moved into the Borger area and built a massive refinery to process the local crude. That refinery became the anchor of the whole region's economy, and it is still operating today, nearly a century later, as one of the largest refineries in Texas. And there was a second industry that made Borger essential. Carbon black. Carbon black is a fine black powder made from natural gas, a crucial industrial material used to make tires, ink, paint, and countless other products. The Panhandle, with its enormous supply of natural gas, became the carbon black capital of America. By the late 1930s, the area around Borger held the great majority of all the carbon black plants in Texas, producing a huge share of the entire nation's supply. The same gas that had drawn the wildcatters now fed a permanent industry. And around those plants, a whole second town was born, one that tells its own remarkable story. Just outside Borger, Phillips Petroleum built a community for its workers from the ground up, a true company town called simply Phillips, Texas. The company built the houses, the school, the stores. Thousands of people lived their whole lives in Phillips, working at the plants, raising families in homes the company owned. For decades, it was a tight-knit, all-American company town in the shadow of the refineries. And then, in 1980, a massive explosion tore through the petrochemical works at Phillips, destroying processing units and damaging homes and businesses for miles. In the aftermath, the company decided to clear the residential town away entirely. The people of Phillips were moved out, their houses removed, and the company town that had stood for half a century simply ceased to exist, erased from the map, leaving the industry, but not the community. It's a haunting echo of Borger's own story. In this corner of Texas, towns can appear and vanish at the pace of the oil business that creates them. But Borger itself endured. The tents and the brothels and the gambling dens gave way to refineries and chemical plants and pipelines. The town that had been the wickedest place in America became a hard-working industrial town, a center of oil refining, carbon black and petrochemicals. Its skyline defined not by saloons but by the towers and flares of the energy industry. Whole company communities grew up around the plants. The wild Boomtown grew into a stable, working, blue-collar city. It came at a cost, of course. This is heavy industry. The air carries the smell of the refineries. The plants have seen their share of accidents and explosions over the decades, and the work is hard and sometimes dangerous. But it is real, and it lasted. Borger found the one thing that lets a boomtown live. A reason to exist after the boom. Today, Borger is a quiet city of around 12,000 people, a fraction of the chaotic 45,000 who once swarmed its 3-mile main street, but a real stable community. Far more than most boomtowns ever become. The refinery still runs. The plants still hum. And the wild, violent, lawless years are now almost a century in the past, remembered in museums and old photographs, and the stories passed down through families. But you can still feel the strangeness of how it all began. A city that appeared on empty grass in 90 days. A town so lawless the army had to occupy it. A founder murdered in his own post office, his killer set free. All of it in the space of just a few years on a windblown patch of the Texas Panhandle, where a moment before there had been nothing at all. So what's the real lesson of Borger, Texas? It's a story about what happens when money arrives faster than law. When you take thousands of people, fill their pockets with cash, strip away every rule and every institution that holds a society together, and drop them onto empty ground 100 miles from anywhere, you don't get a city. Not at first. You get something closer to a frontier in the rawest sense. A place where the strong and the ruthless take whatever they can. And the only question is whether order can arrive before everything burns. In Borger, order barely made it. It took the most famous lawman in Texas. It took the National Guard. It took martial law in an American city in peacetime. And it took the murder of a district attorney to finally force the hand of the state. That's how close Borger came to being completely lost. But the deeper tragedy belongs to Ace Borger himself. He was a brilliant promoter, a man who could conjure a city out of nothing with a stack of handbills and a vision. And that was exactly his undoing. He built a place with no foundation but greed, and he could not control what came rushing in to fill it. The town made him rich, and then it killed him and let his killer walk away. The name Borger still sits on the map of Texas, on the water towers, the road signs, the city hall. But it's also the name of a man who learned, too late, that you cannot build a city out of nothing but the promise of easy money and expect to survive what answers the call. There's something deeply American about the whole saga of Borger, for better and for worse. The boundless optimism, the willingness to conjure a city out of empty grass on the strength of a dream and a sales pitch. The raw, brutal greed, the violence that comes when there's money on the table and no one to enforce the rules. And then at the end, the grinding practical work of building something lasting out of the wreckage. Borger is the entire arc of the American frontier compressed into a single decade. The gold rush madness, the gunfighter chaos, the arrival of the law, and finally the slow settling into ordinary working life. Most frontier stories took half a century to play out. Borger lived the whole thing in about 10 years. And maybe that's why it's worth remembering, because Borger is what happens when you can see the machinery of a society being built in fast forward, with all its ugliness exposed. We like to imagine that order is natural, that civilization is the default. Borger is a reminder that it isn't. That law and safety and decency are things that have to be fought for, sometimes literally, against people who profit from their absence. For 3 years, on a windswept plain in Texas, that fight was nearly lost. That it was finally won, and that a real town full of real families stands there today because of it, is the part of the story worth holding on to. If you found this story as remarkable as I did, consider subscribing. There are dozens more American towns and cities with histories just as wild and just as forgotten, and we're going to tell every one of them.